Foster Care Nation, listen up. This is
Foster Care and Unparalleled Journey.
Strength for the powerless, courage for the fearful, hope and healing for wounded hearts. Hello and welcome back to Foster Care, an Unparalleled Journey with Jason
and Amanda.
And today's guest we have is Dr. Breanna Gentile, which I am going to totally mess up a million times. So we're going to call her Dr. G today. Dr. G completed her bachelor's in psychology at Gonzaga University. She went on to receive 2 master's degrees, one from Golden State University in counseling and the second from Palo Alto University in clinical psychology. Dr. G founded Dr. G's Lab, a trauma-informed design consultancy. She has authored studies that have been published in peer-reviewed journals and has been an invited speaker about trauma-informed practices and design at multiple national conferences and symposiums. Dr. G has spent over 10 years working to improve outcomes for children, teens, and their caregivers working through adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, and toxic stress. Her work with behavioral health providers, communities, and families has allowed her to develop keen insight into the advantages, into the challenges of supporting resilience through trauma-informed practices. She is currently the Director of Product Design at Center for Youth Wellness. You guys can really see where she could fit into our world because adverse childhood experiences is something that I think we have some experience with. What do you think, Amanda?
Maybe just a little.
I have a few in my background. Do you have any?
I think I hit almost every mark.
How about the kids in our house? Do any of our kids have any of that?
Several.
Yeah, I think all would be a more accurate statement.
Quite possibly.
So we're happy to have you here today, Dr. G, because we have trauma in our kids, in ourselves, in our past. We have all these adverse childhood experiences. I've heard it talked about. It sounds really important. And I would love to see what you have to say about it today and maybe help us out become better foster parents.
Oh, I love that. You didn't tell me I had such a high ticket. So yeah, let's jump right in. So let's start with what ACEs are. So as you said beautifully, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. The idea is that there's 10 of them in the original study. So there's 3 big categories. There's abuse, neglect, and household instability. So within abuse, you've got physical and emotional. Within neglect, you have physical, emotional, and I forgot one in abuse, you also have sexual abuse. And then with household instability is where a lot of the country, and I should probably say a lot of the world, will have most of their ACEs from this category, which is mental illness, incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and divorce. So the idea of this study was that children who experience these, particularly ones who have at least 4 or above, are going to be at higher risk for health outcomes that are negative in the future, such as heart disease, chronic disease. They actually have a 20-year, if they're left untreated, a 20-year difference between those who had their ACEs or low ACEs or high ACEs that were treated. So there's a 20-year difference in their lifespan, which I think is fascinating. Like that's a decent amount of life that you could lose out on if you have untreated ACEs. I think it's also important too, before we jump in about, what it's like to parent with your own ACEs, is to just briefly talk about the different stress levels. So, you have positive stress, which is basically to say the presence of a caring and trusted adult can offset that rush of stress hormones. Like you fall, right? That's a little bit of a stress. That's a positive stress for the most part. You fall, you hurt your knee, your parents come in or a supportive adult comes in. Really not too big of a deal. And then you have tolerable stress, which I like to think of as like, preparing for a podcast, for example, or preparing for a test, right? Those are tolerable levels of stress. Your stress hormone goes up. Your body does what it needs to do for that moment, but then eventually it passes and it goes back to this normal state. And then in the last kind of continuum, part of the continuum, we have this idea of toxic stress, which is really these really powerful stress hormones, and they totally overwhelm our body and our brain. And if we don't have support as a child, if we don't have support from a caring or trusted adult, it can result in a lifelong impact of mental and physical health, so as well as their behavior. So I think that's really, when we're talking about ACEs, we're kind of talking more about that circle, so to speak, if you think about it as circles of stress. And that's really where ACEs can live, is in that toxic stress circle.
Yeah. And we've seen a lot of those sorts of toxic stress in our lives. I don't know if you've heard Amanda's backstory. She grew up in a home that was not so
Great.
caring. Yeah, I was trying to find the kind word.
It was not Leave It to Beaver.
That it was not. Amanda should have been. She for sure should have been in the foster care system. She was missed by the system, but had a few people in her life who really reached out and helped when they could. And so that was some of the small pieces of respite she had in her childhood. I had a pretty decent childhood for the most part, but to be fair, I grew up among a religious group that wasn't terribly healthy for me, and it caused me a lot of those stressors and anxieties in my later life as well. So we have that, and then we bring kids in, and amongst our kids, I think all of them at a young age have been drug exposed. A couple of them have seen a parent murdered in front of them. Some of them have had some real long-term chronic drug exposure, have lived homeless and in vacant houses throughout the kind of the part of St. Louis City that's just run down, and that's where a lot of people live, is in those vacant houses. One of them was born addicted to methamphetamines. So we've got a lot of stuff in our family. And so it's challenged for us a lot of times, because some of these kids come in with this stress. Some of it comes in with these trauma reactions to life. And we've had to learn over the years that we have to deal with our own trauma as well as we work through this. So tell me, what is the magic secret to being amazing parents when we've had our own backgrounds and we have kids with difficult backgrounds as well? I'm sure you have a magic pill.
Magic. That magic pill. It's actually been rush delivery to you. You guys should receive it in about 4 minutes by the time this podcast is over.
Yes.
Yes, I know. It's very exciting. So, it's already demanding to be a parent, right? Even if you don't have your own ACEs that you're dealing with, and even if you're working with kids who don't have ACEs, it's already demanding. So what you guys are talking about is like layered complexity, right? And so you might find yourself reacting to toxic level of stress, which it sounds like, yeah, that's definitely happening. And it can show up, for parents, it can show up as impatience, difficulty calming down, a quicker than normal temper. Stress overload can make it really difficult to read your children and model good behavior. So I think that first and foremost, it's like important to understand that it's difficult to do those things as a parent already. But when you have your own ACE score, and especially if it's a high ACE score, you're working with a different level of complexity than other parents who don't have ACE scores. So I think that it's really important to know that about yourselves. And I am too, also a thriver of ACEs, what I like to call myself. So I do find myself being, a little bit more impatient. I do find myself taking quite a bit longer to calm down, I think, than I see some of my other parents. And definitely the thing that really gets me is that ability to model good behavior is not always accessible. Like there's times where I really want to model good behavior and I notice myself and I'm like, I didn't do that. I did not do that. That was not good modeling. So I think that the secret to, quote unquote, happy families is that you're not always happy. And I think that's a really big, important thing to realize. But what is important is learning how to handle those occasional arguments. For me, sometimes they're not as occasional as I'd like them to be. So I'm going to put in that word frequent. It could be, the frequent arguments that might happen. And especially those hard times in a way that leaves you actually, loving your relationship and keeping that relationship intact with your kids. So I have a few ways to do that. I think with kind of the families that you have born children, everybody says, oh, it starts in infancy. And that for me freaks me out. And I gave birth to my 2 children and it still freaks me out. Like it started in infancy. And I knew that going in as a psychologist and all these other things, and it still freaks me out. So I get that it starts in infancy. I understand that. But I always like to say, early is better, but it's never too late. And so when I say it starts in infancy, I'm going to actually like skip over a large part of that part, because I feel like that ship sailed, right? And it sailed for me as a parent. I think I did have, some great moments with my kids, but I know for sure there were some moments that I missed out on, playing peekaboo and singing stories and all those things that they say you're supposed to do. I couldn't exactly do at the time, at all times, because I was dealing with my own stress and my own depression, my own anxiety. I've been 3 years sober, so I had my own rattling with addiction and things like that. So I wasn't always able to do that. And so I think infancy is important, but for so many people, and especially for so many people who are probably listening to this podcast, that ship has sailed. So kind of what else, right? I think the other thing too is getting support. And I would love to know what it's like for you guys, because as I said, I gave birth to my 2 children, and parent support groups were a joke for me. I couldn't handle having conversations about, toilet training and using this particular spoon and finding this particular food and all these other things that just felt rather, surface. I needed deeper support than just a typical, mommy group and how to stay fit. So I would love to kind of pose a question to you guys of like, what do the support groups look like for foster parents? Are there any? And like, how have they been?
So there's several support groups online, on Facebook. You can find several of them. I have several of them on my Facebook page. And I will have to say, as a foster parent and a biological parent, it's really hard to reach out in those groups because I see so much negativity. People will ask questions and they're just looking for help, and they will get bombarded with negativity and how could you and how dare you. And so people pose these questions and they put in front of them, please be kind, or don't respond if you're negative. And so it makes you not want to reach out.
Yeah, great example is back around the holidays when someone asked, how much would you spend on your kids in care in your home as opposed to your biological kids, and I think they had even put in there that there's some groups or some programs of the state that help to provide stuff to the kids and that sort of thing. And oh my goodness, the vitriol that came out of that one was just blew my mind. Why would you even think it's any different? Why would you, if you don't think these kids deserve the same thing your kids do, then you don't deserve to have kids. I mean, people just went straight out hard, and she's not wrong in the online side, especially because the internet gives us that feeling of anonymity, so we can say all the mean things we want to say, and you don't have to worry about the big guy across the, standing in front of you, popping you in the nose for saying it.
Well, it's hard to reach out when you don't feel safe. And then when you get all that negativity, when you're already down.
Yeah, it makes the online support groups less and less effective for sure. And that's one of the things that I would love to see built in. I'm certain there's something out there like it. I'm in a dad's group online, and that's one of the things we are vicious about keeping vulnerability there. And if you're going to come in and be that guy, you get one chance. And the first time you step out of line, you're probably gone, because that's the only way we can keep the integrity of that group up. But it's a real challenge online. And in-person support groups, we have one of those in our area that I know of. And unfortunately, they have those support groups are available on days when we're not typically. And so we haven't been a part of that for a while. And so there's, our support group, when you step outside of that into family, well, Amanda's family is not really part of our life.
No.
And nowadays, neither is mine. And so that whole familial support thing, that's been out the window for a long time for us. So this is a place where we really struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. And it really sounds like almost like the support is actually isolating, which is it's not supposed to serve that purpose. So I really hear what you're saying when you're saying, you almost don't want to reach out for help. And that's how I was feeling too. And that's me as a biological mom being like, you know what? I'm suffering with postpartum depression way past when postpartum is, 4 years later, and I'm still like struggling with like depression and anxiety. And when you reach out and you get these reactions of, that doesn't make sense, don't you find the joy in your child, all of these, judgmental type reactions and comments, you just don't ask. You don't reach out for help, and you end up not getting support. So I do feel you on that. And it's great to hear kind of what you guys are saying, because, it's not that impossible to build that type of stuff in. If you're one of those people who's going to start a group that's, a licensed professional ready to start a group for foster parents, or even just start an app and build an app for foster parents that can give them support. It's really important to know that, one, it's not that easy to reach out. Two, there's a lot of judgment going around. And three, vulnerability, it needs to be at the core. Like, how can you build that in? So I think that that's huge. And I love, Jason, that your group is like one strike and you're out. That's really awesome. And I wonder if, mom groups are similar, if we're a little bit more lenient, but I love that you guys are really focused on that. That's really important. So yeah, getting support and connecting to your community, I think looks different when you're a foster parent, because, sometimes, like you said, you don't have access to your family, and that's gone out the window. And especially with ACEs, there's a lot of times where those relationships have been severed a long time ago, and there's not family support. And then there's a whole thing of trust, right? Like, how do you connect with your community when you don't trust your community? You don't trust the other people that are around you. So we're sitting here being like, we need to have a supportive relationship with our children, and yet we can't even find that supportive relationship as an adult. So it makes things, really complicated. So we need social connection. We know that. Study after study shows that social engagement, it boosts our health and it boosts our happiness and all of these things. But I just feel like there needs to be a little bit more focus on what happens when you have lower resources, right? Like when you don't have a YMCA membership or an after school program or summer camp or anything like that. Like, how do you find that connection to community? So I think this podcast is probably one way for people to do that. So that's important. And then just kind of figuring out as a parent, like, what other ways can I connect to community, if any? And I think too, this idea of knowing your kids and knowing their friends, I think it becomes increasingly more difficult, to be honest with you, especially as a foster parent. If you have teens, it can be really difficult to figure out who's where, whose friends are who, and sometimes they don't even tell you, right? So there's a lot more that you don't know, I think, as a foster parent. And as a biological parent, I know I struggle with that too, because our kids are becoming a lot more visible online and invisible to us, I think, as parents. As they turn to the outward world, they're becoming a little bit less, I guess, trusting maybe of parents' advice, of parents' leadership, guidance. So they're looking to other places, and so it can be hard to figure out, who do you trust, and how can I talk to my parents? I don't know if parents are really having the conversations at the dinner tables that we used to see. So I think that that's also a little bit hard too, is to know where your kids are and who their friends are. And I think, the final thing about this magic potion is there's got to be a go-to for the hard stuff. So, kids are going to have difficult things come up in their lives. And the question is, who do your kids go to, right? So maybe it's mom, maybe it's dad, maybe it's a pastor, a priest, who knows, right? A sports coach, a school counselor. But if you can encourage them to have one supportive adult in their life, even if it's not you, you're far more likely to have a more resilient kid than you would, especially if they experience high levels of adversity. They'll have better school behavior, they'll have better health outcomes than the kids who are not resilient. And so I would just say, if it's not you, that's fine. Be okay with that as a parent, that it's not going to be you, and encourage them to find that one special adult that they can actually, go to when they have difficult things come up.
Yeah, that's something we've done in the past. Our oldest son, he wanted to learn to play guitar as a young kid, and I laughed and said, look, I can teach any idiot to play Smoke on the Water with power chords because I can do it, so I know any idiot can. If you want to play guitar and I'm going to pay for it, you're going to learn how to play. And so he took him to a program where the guy actually taught classical guitar. And Mr. Chris was not only an amazing teacher, he was great with kids, but he and my son kept a connection for years and years, even after he was outside of the program and had moved on. I think they still occasionally connect online from time to time. And he was one of those people that when CJ, our oldest son, was going through some hard stuff, I reached out and said, "Hey, Chris, here's some of the stuff that's going on. If you have a minute here and there to, check in with him from time to time, if you hear something super scary, let us know if you would." But, he's needing some connection. And that was one of the few places where he was willing to take that sort of a connection from another adult that he would not have with us. Because when you get to a certain space in parenting, I think your kids just decide that there are parts of their life they're not going to talk to you about.
Yeah. That's cool though. Kudos to you for noticing that and for not being, one of the very many self-centered parents who say, "No, I want it to be me. It's got to be me. I want it to be me," and forcing that to happen, because a lot of parents will do that and it just creates more and more distrust. So you should really definitely, pat yourself on the back for having that, confidence, I guess, as a parent to say, it's not me right now, but this adult definitely can do the trick.
Well, don't tell me to pat myself on the back. Amanda will tell you that it causes, there's an air pump back there and it makes my head get bigger when I do that.
Noted.
No, we were desperate. We were desperate at that point. We didn't know what we were doing. We just knew that we had a kid in crisis and that child did not feel like coming to us. So the only thing we could think of is what's the next best place for him to have an outlet, and it happened to be his guitar teacher because they were really close, but it helped.
Yeah. Especially because CJ is a very talented guitar player. At like 8th grade, I think he was playing college level material. He's just a talented guy. And so they really connected on that level. That was their connection point. And that's been a challenge for some of our other kids because sometimes it's difficult to find that other responsible adult to put in their life, because I don't know about what life is like in your world or your corner of the world out there, but we have fewer responsible adults in our world than I thought we did.
Yes, that is true. Yeah, I think, especially in a city like San Francisco, our circles are small, and we keep them small because we just don't know without knowing a lot about the other person. If that person is, relatively know they're safe, we don't know if they're, they're good in that sense, if they're beneficial to our kids, or if they could do more harm than hurt. And, I think too, here in San Francisco, we're really careful about, there's a high level still of sex trafficking, which is huge, right? And so when we see adults that we don't know, that aren't our coaches or our teachers, or something that we don't know are part of our kids' lives, it's kind of a big fat no. And so we really have to trust as parents here in the city, we really have to trust that other adult, which I think is why so many of us will probably say, like, no, it's got to be me, right? We got to keep it in this circle because we can be so distrusting of other adults that we don't know. So, but I'm with you on that. There are definitely less responsible adults than I thought there were in the world. So I'm with you on that.
Well, I also think that it's difficult for parents to reach out and ask for help for somebody else because they feel like I'm failing my child. If I can't parent my child, I'm failing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's been even myself, and I only have 2 kids who are really good kids for the most part. But there have definitely been times, even this weekend, actually, to be quite honest, where I was like, I'm failing my child. I'm totally failing my child. Right? He had this moment of pure frustration, and there was kicking, there was throwing stuff, there was just real anger, and I realized, like, wow, I totally failed my child at some point, somewhere down the line. Like, what's going on? And it wasn't that big of a deal. When you look back on it and everything's kind of settled, like, it's really not that big of a deal, but you have this whole narrative in your head about how you could have done things differently long time ago, how you, didn't reach out to this person, or how you didn't ask for help. And I think that happens a lot more, I'll be honest with you, of parents who have had ACEs themselves, because again, like you guys said in the very beginning, we're still trying to heal our own trauma. And a lot of it is suppressed. At least for me, there's a whole lot that I just really have yet to deal with. And it pops up, even though I don't want it to. But I haven't quite dealt with it. And so I know that that's going to come up in different ways. But what it really comes up in is just me, kind of having these really not so great pep shocks with myself of how I messed up as a parent. And I totally understand what you're saying. I hear you 100%.
Yeah, I know when those moments hit for me, I grew up in a world of religion that involved a lot of dogma and a lot of thou shalt nots or you're going to hell. And, at least that's what I heard as a young kid. I don't know that I can say that's exactly what they were preaching, but that's what I heard. A crap ton of that was all that penetrated my mind. And so I know when I see my kids do something, all that stuff, that starts this whole thing running in my head. And if I can't get my kids not to behave that way, like, I was raised up in that mentality that said, if you do this stuff, you're going straight to hell, which was a long list of things that were going to send you straight there. And as a parent, it's really easy to start seeing those sorts of things. That mind starts to run. You start to build these stories in your own mind that you just chase down the rabbit hole. And it takes me about 37 seconds to be in a horribly unhealthy and unhelpful mind frame for my kids. And suddenly I'm just not a good dad in that moment. And I don't care if we're talking biological kids, foster kids, we have adopted kids. So we have 7 kids that we've called our own over the years that come to us all different ways. And that right there is the first thing that will knock me right off of my ability to be there for them, because suddenly I'm in my own headspace. And we've started working through a lot of that over the last several years. We've got a guy now, and Dr. Tom is amazing. I said it before and I'll say it again. I don't think he listens to our podcast, but Dr. Tom has been our saving grace. And do you do clinical work where you work?
I used to do clinical work. Yep, I used to. Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, it's been some of our saving graces here. We've learned so much by having that ability to reach out and find a guy who does this for a living, and he's able to speak into our lives and help us to see the things that we just weren't able to see on our own. And
yeah, that's huge. Yeah.
So you've worked with people like that, you said. What would have been some of the common themes you've seen of those problems that most people face?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is exactly what you just said, is going back into what we were told and just getting into a narrative with ourselves to the point where we're no longer present. And of course, we know, when we're not present, it's largely a part of our brain, which, the prefrontal cortex just goes offline. And that part of our brain is what makes our logical decisions. And that part of our brain helps us to, choose a healthy food or to have a healthy conversation or to calm down. Our cortisol levels, they skyrocket up. And so we're feeling like there's a saber-toothed tiger after us in the middle of a parenting moment. And how can you be a good parent? So I think that was the biggest thing that I saw. And what you mentioned, it really actually brought up something of my own, which was I was told a lot by my grandma, who raised me for a small portion of my life, but definitely a very important part of my life. And she would always say, "Oh, you'll miss me when I'm 6 feet under." And that just always kept this thing in my head of just well, I can't act out, or else she's going to die, right? Or I can't act out, or she's going to think that I don't appreciate her. And so anything of frustration, any moment of sadness, any moment other than happiness and abiding and being a good girl was a moment for you'll like me, you'll think about me, or you'll appreciate me when I'm 6 feet under. And so I was always had this this fear that if I didn't behave, I would be abandoned. And so that came into my whole world as an adult and as a parent, where I tried to not have that conversation of just you'll appreciate me when I'm gone. Or if you have a different mom, when you get a new mom, maybe then you'll miss me, right? I tried so hard not to say that because that's like just a repeat in different words, but it's an absolute repeat of your past. But what it ended up happening as I was trying to not have that conversation with myself is I started to think to myself that I probably am better off, their world is probably better off without me. And that was like a ridiculous thing to think. I understand that, but I had to go to a Dr. Tom, like you said. I had to go to a Dr. Maya, and she had to kind of set me straight, which was like, first of all, like, where is it coming from? And I was able to go back and understand where it came from, but it didn't really help me in the future, in the present, right? Like, it didn't help me be like, okay, well, what do I do? And so she was, we had to have the same conversation over and over again of like, what is it about you that feels like your kids would actually be better off without you? Where is that actually coming from? And, lots of work is still to be done, I will say, but I think what you're bringing up is this idea of getting professional help. It's definitely okay. And it doesn't have to be in the conventional way of therapy, right? I know for me as a brown body, sometimes going to a therapist is just not a place for me. And so I have to go to somebody that's a little bit different. And I have to get that supportive trust and that validation from somewhere a little bit different. So I think that it's important what you bring up, though, is like getting help and working through that is huge. And that came up a lot of just like a shame of getting help. That was definitely a thing that would always come up. And then also this idea of I just don't have what it takes to be a parent. I just don't have what it takes. And so there's a hopelessness in there of like, I don't have the resources. I wasn't raised to have the resources. I'm not a good enough parent, and therefore I shouldn't be a parent. So therefore I'm not going to be a parent. And it was basically getting in the way of them showing up for their kids. And I saw that a lot. So I think that was, what you bring up is real. It's really real.
I've got to ask then, because, you mentioned that whole prefrontal cortex shutting down. And I mean, I'm with you. I totally understand what you're saying. I understand the amygdala hijack very, very well. And so, I've seen it a million times in my own home. I may or may not have experienced it a million times on my own. And so how can somebody who's in the middle of that moment where your amygdala jumps in, and I know when it's fired up because it's that moment when that outside eye looks at me and goes, well, you're a ginormous a-hole right now. And so I know that the amygdala has been fired at that moment. And so how do you bring yourself back, into the present to turn that prefrontal cortex back on, get that part of the brain operating so that you can create the response that you want? I mean, is there anything short of like licking a 9-volt battery and sticking it to your forehead? Or, I don't know if homemade electroshock therapy is a way to go. This is not medical advice.
Hey, since you're bringing that up, let's just go for the full frontal lobotomy. Let's just try that.
Hey, I make knives we could do this.
Okay, see, you already have the resources. I like to say there's really a 4-step process that I use that I find helpful and that I've given to several parents. And the first thing is to stop. Just stop, right? Exactly where you're doing it. Might look funny. It might feel funny, and your kids might be like, whoa, are you okay? But just stop. And you got to ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? And if you can't name it, you don't have to name it, but you can say you're feeling all these different things. My palms are sweaty. I'm freaking out. My head feels like it's about to pop. All these different things you can come up with. Number 2, take a breath and ask yourself, am I breathing too fast right now? Am I holding my breath? Can I even take a deep breath right now? And number 3 is observe. So you have to ask yourself, what else am I feeling in my body? Right? What are my thoughts right now? For me, some of those thoughts are, I'm not a good mom. I'm totally failing at this game. My kids are totally doomed. They're going to grow up and be horrible adults. And then the last one is P for stop. So it spells out stop. And then the 4th one is proceed. So ask yourself, am I okay with what happens next if I blank? Am I okay with what happens next if I yell at my kid? Am I okay with what happens next if I walk away and go outside? Am I okay with what happens next if I decide to do whatever? And then you have to decide to respond in a way that works best for you. I think oftentimes as parents, we're constantly thinking about how do I respond? What's best for my kid? What's best for my kid? Right now, in this moment, when that amygdala is popping up and it's about ready to just take over your entire brain, you have to do what works best for you. So four steps spells out stop. First one is stop. Second one is take a breath. Third one is observe. Fourth is proceed. That seems to work.
I like that. That gives us some real tangible things to try, because now I have Amanda had to go deal with one of those moments where kids are loud, and I can tell you from this distance, 2 rooms away, that there is an amygdala that has been hijacked. It's about 6 years old right now. And that amygdala gets hijacked a lot because, well, that's just his place in life at the moment. So do you teach these same things to young kids like this, or is there a simpler way or a more effective way when you're working with kids to help them build these same things that we as adults need to have figured out?
Yeah, again, I must be a fan of the number 4, but I think the best, easiest way to teach our kids to self-regulate is to, 1, listen to them, right? So listen to what they're saying and then help them name their feelings. All right, I hear that you wanted to go out into the street and get that ball, and it sounds like you're really angry that you can't go get it. Okay, that's good, right? Number 2, you have to acknowledge how hard it is being a kid. I get it. It is super hard to be 6 years old and not be able to just do what you want when you want. I totally understand. And number 3, help them examine the consequences. I think it's a lot better to say how to examine the consequences than to tell them the consequences. So you just say, all right, if you go out into the street by yourself to get that ball, you might get hit by a car and it could really hurt. Right. So that's not telling them, you go out there, you're going to get hit. Right. That's just saying hey, if you do this, then this can happen. And then the 4th one is offer an alternative. How about we go out together to get the ball? You hold my hand, we'll look for cars, we'll get the ball, you don't get hurt, all good. Those are my 4. So I'll go through them one more time. So you listen to what they're saying and help them name their feelings. You acknowledge how hard it is being a kid. You help them examine the consequences. If you do blank, then blank can happen. And then finally, you offer them an alternative. And I will say that this works great if your partner can do the same, or your other supportive adult that's with you can do the same with you. So it doesn't have to just be for your kids. I've actually had to have my mom do this with me, of just okay, yeah, I hear you. Right. Yeah, that sounds really difficult. And then acknowledging how hard it is to be a parent, so it can work for adults too. But I think that that's really important for the kids.
The only problem I see with that second set is that I'm trying to turn that into an acronym, and I just can't come up with a word out of that one.
True. I know. It was good. It was good for the first one, right? Stop is good. But yeah, you've got LAHO. Maybe we could maybe say halo, but then things might get out of order. But
got that right.
As long as you get them all in there, the order probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, that'd be an easy one to remember, because every time Amanda looks at me, she gets to see my beautiful face and my halo, right? Because I'm such a wonderful person.
Yes, it's held up by your little pitchfork.
Ooh, she called it.
We've been together for over 20 years. She knows how much of a quote unquote wonderful person I can be, and she's seen my hard moments. So I will not argue with her.
But going back to the acronym ACEs, can you just explain a little bit? You said there were 10 ACEs. Can you explain what they are and how that's scored and why that's so important?
Yeah, definitely. So there's 10 of them. And then so physical abuse is, I think the abuse ones are relatively self-explanatory. So physical abuse is if you have been hit. It doesn't have to be repeatedly. It doesn't have to draw blood if you have been hit. Emotional abuse is when you're belittled. You're constantly being told that you're not good. You're being put down a lot. Those are some of the common ones that you might see it with the parent-child dyad. And then sexual abuse, obviously we know sexual abuses that can be the whole range, the whole continuum from molestation to rape, anywhere in there. With neglect, physical neglect is not being able to care for your child. And I want to say not being able to, that's not actually accurate. I'm going to say having the ability to do so, but not doing it, right? Because there are times where we may not have the resources to care for our child physically, but we still do it with the littlest resources we have, right? We may be living in a car, but we still make it work. So when you have the ability, but you choose not to, that is physical neglect. Emotional neglect is really just ignoring your child. Again, they come to you with some issues, completely ignored. Perhaps you see there's like a latency in speech or toilet training or anything like that. Again, completely ignored. They come to you with problems about their kid, about other kids at school, teachers, things like that, largely ignored, told it's not happening. Gaslighting is a great example of emotional neglect. The household instability, incarcerated relatives. A lot of people think that, just having a mom or dad is incarcerated relative. But you can have an aunt, an uncle, a grandpa, a grandma. It doesn't have to be even in your immediate family, and it can still affect you. So it's just the idea of the instability that can really affect the kids when it comes to incarcerated relatives. Mental illness. So that can be, I think, largely, for me, postpartum depression definitely affected, I think, maybe probably not my youngest because I kind of had it under wraps by then, but my oldest may have had, a couple of moments where I was not able to be the best mom that I could be because my depression just couldn't get me there. I would also say, schizophrenia, personality disorders. One of the biggest one that goes completely unnoticed until you're an adult is narcissism, where you realize you had a narcissistic parent or caregiver, and you don't realize that until you're an adult. I think that is probably one of the largest mental illnesses that goes unnoticed, or at least undiagnosed for a very long time. Mother treated violently. It's interesting because there's a couple of things about fathers being treated violently, and it just doesn't have that same impact. So it's really interesting, and I'm sure we could have a whole other conversation about that. But there's really something that really impacts the child when they see their mother being treated violently. Substance abuse. So if either parent had substance abuse, it can also be an aunt, an uncle, anybody that's largely taking care of them or primary caregiver, substance abuse. A lot of that is kind of debatable with cannabis use. I think there are definitely cultures who view cannabis as just the same as they would heroin, and there are cultures who say cannabis is fine, it's healing, it's of the earth, all of these things. I think that was largely really depends on your culture. And then divorce. And I'm gonna be an advocate for divorce here, because there are many times where leaving and breaking a marriage is more healthy for the kids than staying in a marriage and keeping that. So I am one of probably the few women that will say that I'm not quite sure if divorce should be there. I think that divorce impacts our kids, definitely, but I'm not quite sure if it's always adversely. I think that there are several relationships that and families that do much better when you reshape it and reconfigure the family. So I'll keep divorce there because I wasn't the original researcher, and I respect that research that has been done. But I will say that divorce doesn't always adversely affect our children in a way that we may think so.
So how do they score that? Your ACE score, and what does that mean, I guess, when you have a specific ACE score in your life?
Yeah, so essentially, in California, we have mandated ACE screening at our pediatric wellness visits. And so everybody gets screened basically at your pediatric well visit. And so you will be given this, they'll ask you if you've experienced any of these things, and then you get a point for each one. If you have about a 4 or above, that is considered a high ACE score. And the way that we really think about it is that, 4 or more, really, ACEs are incredibly common. I think that first needs to be said. ACEs are incredibly common. Like 67% of the people during this original study had at least one ACE, and 13% had 4 or more ACEs. So it's not really uncommon to have at least one ACE in this world. But once you get up to 4, that's when we start to look at other services, right? So the way that our clinic works is they'll be screened at their healthcare provider. And then if they have 4 or more, they will be, I want to say referred, more like warmly handed off to our clinic, where we'll do, anything from individual to family to dyad. So that's at that point is when we start to warmly hand off into our clinicians and get them into therapy and family therapy. And some of that starts as early as 5. Some of that doesn't start until later off in the game, and when they're 9, 10, 13 even. So I think the biggest thing that is important is to see that there is a link between the medical part and the psychological part, right? It's not just you've experienced trauma, let's work through that in psychology. It's like you've experienced trauma and your body has now kept the score. Your nervous system is disrupted. Your cardiovascular system is, elevated most of the time, and you've got inflammation, and that can damage your arteries over time. Your immune system is constantly firing, so you're at higher risk for infection. Your endocrine system, toxic stress, the impact grows and develops over time. And so your endocrine system is responsible for weight management and things like that. So if you don't get it under check, that leads to obesity. It leads to changes in the timing of puberty and other sort of issues. So the focus of ACEs is not just that these terrible things have happened to you. It's that, and your body is keeping the score.
Now, when you look at adults who are seeing this stuff for the first time or really beginning to take this into account into their own lives, what do we do with adults when you suddenly realize that you've got an ACE score out of a 15 out of 10?
Yes. So as I said before, early is better, but it's never too late. So talk to professionals, right? Definitely with, the ACEs score is available online. Anybody can take it. We recommend it at Center for Youth Wellness to do it with a licensed practitioner, because the questions alone can just bring up a lot of stuff. So the retraumatizing is definitely something that can happen if you're taking it on your own. It's just nice to take it with somebody that you can talk through things right away. So if you've taken it and you're like, yep, that's me, and you also take note of your health, like, okay, I am definitely overweight. I, could definitely probably have high cholesterol. So you have to take stake in both of them. And if it's just too much to take stake of one or the other, take stake of your physical health, because the physical health is something that typically people are able to see noticeable differences. They feel a little bit more motivated. It's not that one is more important than the other. It's just a simple fact that us as humans are motivated a little bit more by tangible things that we can see and change. So we can change our weight. We can bring down our cholesterol. We can increase our cardiovascular activity, all of those things. Once those things feel a little bit more manageable, start to revisit those adverse, experiences. Do it with somebody you trust, someone that will validate you, somebody that will positively encourage you, and somebody that will reduce the stigma of getting help and the things that happen to you. So I say you really need to take care of both, but I know that can be overwhelming. As for me, it was extremely overwhelming, and I chose to tackle my weight first. I knew I was obese. I knew I was dangerously close to being diabetic. And I was able to wrap my head around what I needed to do to get those down before I could actually wrap my head around getting back into therapy and talking about my trauma as a child.
I know you mentioned, your struggles with postpartum. Do you think that that's related to some of the stuff that you experienced in your childhood?
Absolutely. Yes, for sure. And my mom was a single mom, and we came from a town. She's fair skinned, and so, white by nature. And my dad was black. And so there was still a lot of racism at that time. And my mom was told, if she doesn't come out with nappy hair, just don't tell her about her dad. So I was already kind of having these shameful things in utero. And then, of course, when I was born, my mom and my dad separated roughly about 3 years after that. So I was born out of wedlock. My family was pretty religious. There were a whole bunch of other things that kind of went into it. And then I was also born with a congenital cataract because they had to use forceps in order for a successful delivery. So, and my mom at the time didn't have insurance, and so she had to go with a practicing doctor, not somebody who was actually a licensed doctor. So all of those mini traumas, I like to call them, kind of added up for my mom, and she did the absolute best that she possibly could. And I was lucky enough to have a grandpa that stepped in as my father figure, and I, had a village eventually. But what I saw was that you have to be okay. Eventually, you just have to be okay. And that never clicked for me. So I think what it was it was seeing my mom's trauma. And then it was also that I had, my hormonal system was not really coming up to play. So the serotonin wasn't spiking, the dopamine wasn't spiking. Things were just kind of at a low level lull. And I was able to find joy, absolutely. And I was able to, nurse my child and do all of the things that you're supposed to do as a quote unquote happy mom. But the childhood story continued. I had sexual abuse in my past that I never dealt with, and I never told anybody. And so that started to pop up of just the images that would come up in my head of like, oh my goodness, what if my child is taken? And then my mind would just run crazy with all of the horrible things that could happen to my kid. And they all had to deal with sexual abuse. So absolutely that constant, imagery that would pop up and the constant, oh my gosh, what if, it kept me at a very low level of energy, and that depression just continued way past what is considered postpartum.
Wow. Well, and you kind of glossed over something earlier. I just wanted to go back and mention it. The fact that you're 3 years sober, because, I'm slightly ahead of you. I'm about 4.5. So just keep trying to catch me. And that's the best advice I give anybody who's behind me on that journey. But yeah, because, all those traumas in our life, it really feeds those addictive, I want to say addictive personalities, but I think oftentimes that's a bit of a misnomer. I think it's the addictive brain more likely.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree with you. And I always say when somebody starts talking about addictive personalities, and I say, it's not really a choice, right? And I know that personality things aren't necessarily a choice, but I was not born with a temperament. I was not born addicted to drugs, right? So I don't have this kind of wired, or like, my body wasn't already addicted to a drug. I chose that because it helped me with my anxiety. It helped me with my depression. It helped me feel connected. It helped me with my isolation. And quite frankly, it kept the thoughts away. It kept them at bay. And so, that was basically my brain saying, let's not think about that. There is no saber-toothed tiger. And the only way that I could reckon with the fact that there was no saber-toothed tiger was to either drink or smoke. So absolutely, I totally think that you're right about the addictive brain. So thank you for that. I appreciate, and congratulations on 4.5. That's incredible.
Well, thank you. But let me push a little bit deeper in there to something you just said, because I don't know of much research that's been done, but of the 4 kids we've adopted, we know that at least 2 of them had all of them had some very early childhood drug exposure. And I know our youngest is he was born exposed to methamphetamines. He was addicted enough at his birth that he spent the almost 2 weeks on a methadone wean down in the hospital before he was able to come home. Then once he did come home, he was taken from mom. He was given to a family member who had him for one night, and he said, "I'm out. I can't do this." Because if you've never experienced a baby who's withdrawing off of methamphetamines or methadone, I mean, I'm going to tell you, that one's rough.
Any drug.
Yeah, that one's rough for an infant, for a newborn. And I just happened to be the personality to take that. And at that point, our oldest daughter was spending a lot of time in the hospital. She was very ill with a very rare disease, and my wife spent a lot of time up there. And so I was home with a drug addicted baby. And all I'm going to say is God puts kids in the place they need to be sometimes in that moment, because little Mr. Frankie he was a handful, but I'm the guy wired for that for some reason. And he stayed, he did really well in our house through that time. And the part that I'm not always certain how to handle, though, because there's not much science around it, is what does that mean for him as he grows older, and the other kids who were even exposed at a young age, because I'm not certain what that's going to mean in his little brain and his personality and his psyche and the way his brain develops, as to what that's going to lead us through with him.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I don't actually have the answer to that. And I think that is something that I don't know if it's being studied, but it is interesting to think about when our brains are already at a young age during that time where we have, a high level of myelination or pruning, where, we go to sleep and we kind of have a garden team that goes in and takes the stuff that we didn't use for that day and, prunes the trees that we did use, so to speak, and keeps everything kind of intact. Like, what happens if that team is largely, not functioning at the same level, or if it's completely busted, right? Like, I don't know what happens, but you're absolutely right to be thinking about that, because we talk about what happens when our parents are going through substance abuse and what that can do, but we don't actually talk about, at least from where I haven't seen what happens to the kids who are born addicted.
And I understand that most doctors aren't willing to even try to figure out how to do an ethical study on the effects on measurable amounts of different drugs in the body and brain while a child's in utero. There's just not an ethical way to do that study, because most of the people who are using some sort of illicit substance are not going to step in for a study, and no doctor is going to be able to say, "Hey, I know this is going on," and create some sort of study around that. So it leads us to a lot of question marks. I think that's probably one of the challenges that we're going to face as a culture until we get rid of this whole scourge of drugs in our land, because, and I don't argue about the marijuana thing a whole lot with people, but in our area, honestly, the real scourge of drugs has been methamphetamine and heroin use, because they're both very cheap and very accessible and very common. And I see a lot of the kids that we deal with who struggle with that.
Yeah, San Francisco, I think San Francisco's biggest thing is cannabis. And so you've got kids, vaping at a very young age. But I think right now, just, at least, again, I'm in a place of privilege, so I have to first reckon with that. But I think from what I see, the kids who are seeing heroin abuse and methamphetamine abuse are not quite seeing the luxurious side of it, versus we have, microdosing, especially in the Silicon Valley, and people who are coming up with these apps and different, ventures and different entrepreneurial, dreams, so to speak. Microdosing with LSD and different things like that is very popular. And so that happens quite a bit. And it happens amongst our are teens who are actually really privileged and well off. So that can be a little bit more, for me, a little bit more scary as a parent because it's expensive. And so, you know, when something's expensive and accessible, it just kind of opens up a whole different channel for like, how do you get the money, right? It's not a matter of how do you get the drug, because that's easy, but how do you get the money to get the drug? And so you've got petty crimes, you've got a lot of theft, you've got a lot of robberies and things like that. But I think, you know, it's becoming different, I think, as we get a little bit, I guess, more into the health culture, but I still haven't seen it hit in the drug scene. I've seen it hit in the alcohol scene, where it's a lot more popular to have, you know, your non-alcoholic beverages, and there's just a whole slew of industry that's out there for non-alcoholic beverages. But I have yet to see that for the drug industry, and I don't know if it will ever happen because there's not really anything that you can replace. There's not a great replacement for those drugs and the things that it offers, and the reprieve that it offers for some folks.
Well, and I want to hit on, you talk about it's different where you're from, and it's definitely different where we're at, because we have a child that's struggling with marijuana usage, and we can't find a single place that will help us because it's only marijuana.
Yeah, isn't that funny? I think that comes up a lot too in divorce cases, and trying to say, like, I as a parent, I think I should have the most custody because this other parent is using marijuana multiple times a day. People don't touch it. So it's very interesting that it has become, not just accepted, but really not even looked at anymore as something that could be potentially an issue. So I can imagine as a parent how frustrating that would be, because I imagine it's very similar here in San Francisco. What else is going on besides that? That's not that bad, right?
Right. And I mean, I'm not here to say I'm pro or against marijuana. I have seen, in my own life, I used to take care of people with special needs, and one of them had a seizure disorder, and taking her medications that happened to be, marijuana really, really helped. It did really help with her seizures. So I think there's definitely some medical purposes there. But when we're just using it to alter our state of mind and our reality, we're not facing the reason why we're doing that.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point of, it's one thing to be treating things medically. And I think another thing that's, becoming a lot more popular here in the Bay Area is the use of MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I think you're right on when you start to talk about the medical impacts of it. And I'm all for, using things that are non-conventional to have a very beneficial medical impact. I'm all for that. But when we're just using and we don't really know why we're using it, if it's not really actually benefiting our body, there does come a point where you are, you're not using it. So I think it's a federal thing too, of just, what are the best practices? What are the guidelines for using marijuana in such a way that it is, for good purpose and for health purposes? And at what point do you cross over into just being recreational, right? So yeah, there's a lot of questions around that. And I agree with you. I'm neither for nor against, but I am for checking in on why we're using it.
Yeah, that's one of the things in our culture that just seems to be pervasive, is that oftentimes it's not for anything other than just a chemical shortcut to a place of, I hate to even say happiness, a moment of happiness. Maybe I think that's probably where it begins. And then eventually it becomes a thing that just fills in that hole. And it's a chemical shortcut. And that takes away, especially kids, teenagers' ability to work through things and get to a place where they're actually content with their own lives, and they become dependent on that chemical for that shortcut.
Yeah, absolutely. Shortcuts that's a really great way to put it. And I think that they're sought after. I think that especially given the time that, these teens now have grown up with the internet their whole life. I think, at least for myself, I grew up when the internet was just coming. And so it was like I had a portion of my life where I didn't have the internet. And so I didn't really, I couldn't search for shortcuts. They just didn't exist. Cliff Notes was like the ultimate shortcut that I had, right? So I think that you're absolutely right. There is a shortcut to resilience. There's a shortcut to coping. And I think that when we talk about shortcuts and we talk about, life hacks, they're great. And I think that we need to kind of think about our drug and toxic stress and, ACEs, and we need to start thinking about it with a little bit of a tech and innovative mindset of like, look, people are going to be searching for shortcuts from here on out. Like, we're just taking shortcuts, right? Like, I don't think we're going to be going back to the way of not taking shortcuts. So if that's the case, what is the shortcut to resilience if you've struggled with ACEs? And if it is going to be cannabis, if it is going to be, a drug of some sort, how do we regulate that? How do we really get the best practices of that? Can we start doing studies to see if, indeed, smoking 2 times a day does, help with your trauma and help with your ACEs? I think that we really need to start thinking about that because shortcuts are the new way. I think we should make a shirt or a cup or something about that. Shortcuts are the new way. I really like that.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that the shortcuts necessarily lead you to the exact same place usually. I see sometimes it leads us to something that looks similar, but it's not quite the same. And and again, a lot of it comes down to intention, how you use things, whether or not it's something that can be beneficial for you in the long run. For me, my chemical shortcut of choice was bourbon. And I can say that I love the taste of bourbon. I haven't had any bourbon in 4.5 years, but there's a reason for that. And I won't dive off into my own issues that it took me years to really fully understand why I was doing what I was doing and where. But I know that where it took me to was not a place of happiness or health or healing. What it took me to was a place of numbing. And that allowed me to at least turn off the pain, but it didn't do anything to heal me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My shortcut was champagne. It was a shortcut to feeling good enough as a parent, which I had already struggled with for a long time. It was a shortcut to feeling a release of stress. It was a shortcut to feeling connected to my partner, that, okay, here we are as parents, we can, let our hair down, it's Friday. It was a shortcut to feeling comfortable in my skin at any parent event or any event, quite frankly. And you're absolutely right. I ended up in the same spot as you, and it wasn't healing. It wasn't healthy. And so I think that you're hitting on something that's really key, which is that shortcuts exist, but they don't necessarily exist to healing. There's really no shortcut to healing. And that goes for the physical and the mental piece of health. There's no shortcut around ACEs. There's no shortcut to toxic stress and dealing with toxic stress. You have to go the long route, and it's not a quick fix either. So I think that, as you can probably attest to with sobriety, the first couple of days are I don't know, for me anyways, first couple of weeks were hell, right? And then eventually it wasn't so bad, and then after that it got bad again, and so it's like a wave, right? And it's not always so easy, and there's still times where I will hear a champagne bottle and I'll be like, oh man, today's the day. We're just going to start this. We're going to start the count all over again. Right? So I totally feel like a lot of people feel like it's kind of should be, this journey that is continually getting better and feeling better and healing. And working through trauma is not like that. It is difficult. And then it gets easy and it's beautiful, and then it's difficult again, and then it sucks, and then it's fantastic and beautiful, and it's layered, it's complex, and there's no shortcut to it. But in the end, you will get to a place that is more healing and is more healthy than where you started.
I love that. And that's what we're all really searching for, right? It's that pathway to the pathway to the place that's more beautiful than where we started.
Absolutely.
And most of us have a hard time in the hard places believing it even exists, but it's there. It's just there for us to find, and we have to be willing to do the hard work to search it out.
Yep, that's right. Well said.
Now, what was the name of the organization you said you were working with again? I know you said it, and I don't want to.
Yeah, I work. No problem. I work for Center for Youth Wellness.
Okay. And is that a place where people could reach out to you if they wanted to touch base with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm on the website under our team. You can certainly find us there, but it's centerforyouthwellness.org is the organization, and a lot of the content that I shared with you today comes from our parent-facing or community-facing initiative, which is Stress Health. And the idea of that was that we all deal with stress and that there's a healthy way to deal with that. So Stress Health put together, stresshealth.org. There's a lot of there's toolkits on there. There's video that you can watch, all sorts of things about the ACEs and toxic stress. And the 7 domains of wellness is what we ask our parents and communities in general to kind of take stock in and consider those as ways you can mitigate your toxic stress. That was really hearing. So yeah, I'm there. I'm all around.
All right. Well, that's great. That way people can find you online if they would like to. I'll make sure that we get that linked up in the show notes because that's the easiest place to put some links so people can find you. I just want to thank you for coming in here today, Dr. G, and giving us your time and being so open and vulnerable with not only giving away plenty of free advice and helping people, but also being open and vulnerable with your own experiences.
Thank you. Thank you for offering that space. Great to do that and be able to do that. Supportive place. So, thank you.
Okay, Foster Care Nation, thank you for listening to Dr. G's story. Now take her knowledge and wisdom to heart so you can create love and healing in your family and community. Be sure to come back next week. We have new episodes every Tuesday. If you would like to share your story as a guest, you can reach us at fostercareuj@gmail.com. You can connect with other like-minded people on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/fostercareuj. Don't forget, we have an account over at Buy Me a Coffee where you can support us for just a few dollars a month or in individual times, whatever works for you. It's at buymeacoffee.com/fostercare. The links to everything are in the show notes on your podcast player or at fostercarenation.com. And as always,
you are so super awesome. I think you guys are cool. Yeah. Thank you for listening.